The coffee in Hyunwoo Kim's mug had gone cold hours ago, but he didn't notice. His eyes stayed fixed on the massive display screen that showed the edge of human space. Thousands of tiny dots marked the positions of defense platforms, each one a silent guardian watching the darkness beyond. Hyunwoo had been the commander of Bastion Prime for 12 years. In all that time, the screen had never shown what it was showing now. A red cluster of dots was moving toward the boundary line that marked where human space began. The computer counted them automatically. 200 ships, all of them big. "All of them armed, sir," called out Jin-Ho Lee from his station across the control room. "The fleet is still coming toward us. They're not slowing down." Hyunwoo stood up from his chair and walked to the main display. The approaching ships belonged to a species called the Velkari. He had read about them in the intelligence reports. They were hunters, predators who traveled from star to star looking for weak civilizations to destroy and eat. They had wiped out 17 different species in the past century. "Have they responded to our warning signals?" Hyunwoo asked. "No, sir," replied Yoonji Cho, the communications officer. "We've been broadcasting on all frequencies for the past 6 hours. They're ignoring us completely." Hyunwoo nodded slowly. This was not unexpected. The Velkari were famous for their arrogance. They believed they were the strongest species in the galaxy. They had probably never heard of humans before, and if they had, they didn't care. The boundary around human space was more than just an imaginary line on a map. It was a real barrier protected by the most advanced defense system ever built. The Terran defense grid had taken 50 years to construct and had cost more money than most planets made in a century. But it was worth every credit. The grid was made up of thousands of automated platforms hidden throughout space around human territory. Each platform was equipped with weapons that could destroy entire fleets. But the weapons were not the most frightening part of the grid. The most frightening part was that it had never failed. Not once in 30 years had anything entered human space without permission, and nothing that tried had ever lived to tell about it. "Sir, I'm getting a priority message from Fleet Command," said Yoonji. "Put it through," Hyunwoo ordered. The face of Fleet Admiral So-Young Park appeared on the screen. She was an old woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen too many battles. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, despite the fact that she was commanding from the bridge of a warship, millions of kilometers away. "Commander Kim," she said without any greeting. "What's the status of the approaching fleet?" 200 Velkari ships, Admiral. They're maintaining course and speed directly toward the boundary. Estimated time to contact is 4 hours and 23 minutes. Admiral Park's expression didn't change. "Have they responded to warnings?" "No, ma'am." Complete radio silence. "Very well. Initiate Protocol 7. I want every civilian ship recalled immediately. Close all trade routes and seal all diplomatic channels. As of now, human space is under complete lockdown." "Yes, ma'am," Hyunwoo replied. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but he had been preparing for it his entire career. Protocol 7 was the highest level of alert in the human defense system. It meant that war was coming, and every human in space needed to get behind the protection of the grid as quickly as possible. Merchant ships would abandon their cargo and race for the nearest human port. Diplomatic vessels would cut short their missions and flee for safety. Even the most important trade negotiations would be stopped immediately. Within minutes of Hyunwoo's order, the space around human territory began to empty. Ships that had been traveling between stars suddenly changed course and headed for home. Space stations that normally bustled with activity from dozens of species suddenly became quiet as all non-human visitors were politely but firmly asked to leave. The Velkari fleet continued its approach, unaware that they were flying toward the most dangerous place in the galaxy. Hyunwoo walked over to Jin-Ho's station and looked at the technical readouts. The grid's sensors could detect ships from incredible distances, far beyond what any other species thought was possible. They could also do much more than just detect. They could analyze, target, and destroy with precision that bordered on the supernatural. "How long since the last intrusion attempt?" Hyun-woo asked. Jin-ho checked his records. 14 months, sir. 3 pirate ships tried to raid a mining station near the Centauri system. The grid eliminated them before they got within a light year of their target. That was typical. Most of the ships that tried to enter human space were criminals or pirates who thought they could sneak past the defenses. They were always wrong. The grid didn't care if you were a massive invasion fleet or a single smuggler's ship. If you entered human space without permission, you would be destroyed. No exceptions, no mercy, no survivors. But this was different. This wasn't a small group of criminals trying to steal cargo. This was a full military fleet from one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The Valkyrie had conquered worlds with smaller fleets than this one. "Sir," called Yoon-ji from her station, "I'm picking up transmissions from the Valkyrie fleet. They're talking to each other on an open channel." "Can you translate?" Hyun-woo asked. "The computer is working on it now," she replied. After a moment, alien voices began speaking through the translation system. The words were harsh and filled with confidence. "The prey world grows closer," said one voice. "Their defenses will crumble like all the others." "War Prime Thekmor promises us rich feeding," said another. "The soft flesh humans will make good, slaves for those we don't eat." "I see no ships fleeing," said a third voice. "Perhaps they are too frightened to run." Hyun-woo felt a cold anger building in his chest. The Valkyrie were talking about humans like they were animals to be hunted. They spoke of slavery and feeding as if they were discussing the weather. These creatures had wiped out entire civilizations, and now they thought they could do the same to humanity. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "Sir, the boundary sensors are showing the first Valkyrie scouts crossing the line," reported Jin-ho. Hyun-woo looked at the display screen and watched as several small dots moved past the red line that marked the edge of human space. For a moment, nothing happened. The dots continued moving inward, heading toward the nearest human colony. Then, quietly and without any drama, the dots simply disappeared. "Contact lost with Valkyrie scouts," Jin-ho reported in a calm voice. "No debris detected. No distress signals received." This was how the grid worked. There were no explosions, no dramatic light shows, no evidence that anything had ever existed. The defense platforms simply unmade things at the most basic level, breaking apart the bonds that held atoms together. One moment a ship existed, the next moment it was just empty space. The main Valkyrie fleet seemed confused by the disappearance of their scouts. Hyun-woo could hear more alien voices through the communication system, all of them talking at once. They couldn't understand what had happened to their advance ships. "Send more scouts!" ordered a commanding voice that must have belonged to War Prime Thekmor. "Find out what happened to the first group." More dots appeared on the screen, crossing the boundary line in larger numbers. This time, 20 ships entered human space, and just like before, they simply vanished without a trace. The grid worked with perfect efficiency, eliminating each target the moment it crossed the line. Hyun-woo smiled grimly as he watched the Valkyrie fleet finally come to a stop just outside the boundary. After losing 30 ships to absolutely nothing, even their arrogance had limits. But he knew this was just the beginning. The Valkyrie were predators, and predators didn't give up easily. They would try again, probably with their entire fleet. And when they did, they would discover why no one entered human space unasked. The coffee in his mug was still cold, but Hyun-woo didn't care. He had work to do. War Prime Thekmor stood 8 feet tall, covered in thick scales that had turned dark red with age and battle scars. His 4 arms ended in claws that could tear through metal, and his mouth was filled with teeth designed for ripping flesh from bone. He was the perfect example of Valkyrie evolution, a creature built for killing and conquest. Right now, he was very confused. Explain to me again what happened to my scouts, he growled at his tactical officer, a smaller Velkari named Vorthak. They simply vanished, War Prime, Vorthak replied, his voice shaking slightly. Our sensors show them crossing into human territory, and then nothing. No explosions, no weapons fire, no debris. They just stopped existing. Thekmor's tail lashed behind him in anger. In his long life, he had conquered 17 different worlds. He had seen every type of defense system the galaxy had to offer. Energy shields, missile networks, fighter squadrons, orbital fortresses. He had broken them all. But he had never seen anything like this. Perhaps it is some kind of cloaking device, suggested Navigator Jektal from her position at the sensor station. The humans might be using stealth technology to hide their ships. Then where are the human defenders? Thekmor demanded. Where are their fleets? Their warnings? Their desperate attempts to negotiate? Every species we have conquered has tried to talk to us, to beg for mercy. These humans show us nothing but empty space. The truth was that Thekmor was beginning to feel something he had never experienced before. Uncertainty. The Velkari were the apex predators of the galaxy. They had evolved on a world where everything tried to kill everything else. And they had won. They were faster, stronger, and more vicious than any other species they had encountered. But the humans weren't fighting them. They weren't even acknowledging their existence. They were just making Velkari ships disappear as if they had never been built. Send another wave, Thekmor ordered. 50 ships this time. Whatever the humans are using, it can't work against that many targets at once. The command was relayed throughout the fleet, and 50 Velkari warships moved forward in formation. These weren't scouts. They were full battle cruisers, each one capable of destroying a planet's surface. Their weapons were charged and ready, their shields at maximum power. They crossed the boundary line with confidence, their crews eager for battle. The Velkari lived for combat, and they had been denied it for too long. Aboard Bastion Prime, Jin Ho, Lee watched the approaching ships with professional interest. The grid's computers had already calculated the exact position and trajectory of each vessel. Weapons platforms were moving into position throughout the region, emerging from hyperspace at precisely the right moments. 50 targets confirmed, he reported to Commander Kim. All platforms are ready and locked on. Hyun-woo nodded. Execute defensive protocol. Eliminate all targets. Jin-ho pressed a single button on his console. Light years away, invisible weapons fired with perfect precision. The Velkari ships didn't even have time to realize they were under attack before they ceased to exist. All targets eliminated, Jin-ho reported. Total time, 4.7 seconds. On the Velkari command ship, chaos erupted. 50 of their finest warships had just vanished in less than 5 seconds. The sensor readings made no sense. There had been no weapon signatures, no energy discharges, nothing that would indicate an attack had taken place. "This is impossible," roared Thekmor. "Nothing can destroy 50 battlecruisers that quickly." But the evidence was right there on their screens. Where 50 ships had been, there was now nothing but empty space. Not even wreckage remained. "War Prime," said Vorthak quietly. "Perhaps we should reconsider this attack. The humans clearly have some kind of weapon system that we don't understand." Thekmor's claws extended in fury. "Are you suggesting we retreat? That the mighty Velkari should run from these soft-skinned weaklings? I'm suggesting that we gather more information before we—" Thekmor's massive hand struck Vorthak across the face, sending the smaller alien crashing into a nearby wall. "The Velkari do not retreat. We do not gather information. We conquer, or we die." The other bridge officers shrank back in fear. They had seen their War Prime in this mood before, and it never ended well for anyone who disagreed with him. But privately, many of them were beginning to think that Vorthak had been right. They had lost 80 ships without inflicting any damage on the enemy. They didn't even know where the enemy was. For the first time in their species' history, the Velkari were facing something they couldn't understand or defeat through simple violence. Miles away from the main fleet, a single human ship drifted in the darkness. The stealth frigate Silent Arrow was invisible to Velkari sensors, its hull covered in materials that absorbed rather than reflected energy. Captain Yoonji Cho sat in the command chair, watching the alien fleet through her ship's advanced sensors. "Captain," said her tactical officer, "the Velkari have stopped their advance. They appear to be confused." Yoonji almost smiled. Confused was a good word for it. The Velkari were predators who had built their entire civilization around the idea that bigger and stronger always won. They had no concept of how to deal with an enemy they couldn't see or understand. "Any signs they're preparing to retreat?" she asked. "No, ma'am. If anything, they seem to be getting more agitated. Heat signatures from their ships suggest their crews are in an aggressive state." That was typical of predator species. When faced with something they couldn't understand, they became more violent, not less. It was an evolutionary response that had served them well against most enemies, but it would only get them killed against humans. "Continue monitoring," Yoonji ordered, "and prepare a full report for Fleet Command. They'll want to know exactly how the Velkari react to losing ships." Back on the Velkari command ship, Thekmor was pacing back and forth across the bridge. His 4 arms gestured wildly as he spoke to his assembled officers. "The humans think they can hide behind their tricks and their technology," he snarled. "They think they can make us afraid with their invisible weapons. But they have never faced the full might of a Velkari battle fleet." The officers said nothing. They had learned long ago that when Thekmor was in this mood, it was better to stay quiet and let him rant. "We will advance with the entire fleet," Thekmor continued. "Every ship, every weapon, every warrior. Whatever the humans are using against us, it cannot stand against 200 ships attacking at once. We will crush them, and then we will feast on their bones." The bridge crew exchanged nervous glances. They were brave warriors, but they were not stupid. Attacking an enemy that had just destroyed 50 ships without taking any damage seemed like suicide. But none of them dared to voice their concerns. "War Prime," said the communications officer hesitantly. "We're receiving a transmission from the human territory. It's being broadcast on all frequencies." "Put it through," Thekmor ordered. A calm, human voice filled the bridge, speaking in perfect Velkari through the translation system. "This is your final warning. You have entered restricted space. Turn back now or face the consequences. We do not wish to destroy you, but we will if you force us to." Thekmor laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "They do not wish to destroy us. Do you hear that? The prey species is trying to sound threatening." But some of the bridge officers noticed that the human voice hadn't sounded frightened or desperate. It had sounded patient, like someone explaining a simple fact to a child who refused to understand. "Send a reply," Thekmor ordered. "Tell them that the Velkari bow to no one. Tell them we are coming to feed on their flesh and enslave their young. Tell them—" "War Prime," interrupted the sensor operator. "I'm detecting movement throughout human space. Hundreds of objects are emerging from hyperspace. They appear to be weapons platforms." Thekmor turned to look at the tactical display. Suddenly, the empty space around human territory was filled with contacts. Weapons platforms were appearing everywhere, surrounding the Velkari fleet in a perfect sphere of destruction. For the first time since the battle began, Thekmor felt something that might have been fear. There were more human weapons platforms than he had ships. Each one was larger than a Velkari destroyer, and their energy signatures suggested firepower beyond anything he had ever seen. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Over 3,000 platforms. War Prime. All of them are targeting our fleet." Thekmor stared at the display screen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. 3,000 weapons platforms, each one probably capable of destroying multiple ships. And they had appeared out of nowhere, as if the humans had been waiting for exactly this moment. The truth was beginning to dawn on him. The humans hadn't been caught off guard by the Velkari attack. They had been ready for it. More than ready. They had been hoping for it. "All ships," he said slowly, "prepare for battle." It was going to be the last order he ever gave. The Velkari fleet moved forward like a wall of death. 150 warships, each one bristling with weapons that could crack planets. Their formation was perfect, their timing precise. This was how the Velkari had conquered 17 civilizations, with overwhelming force applied without mercy. War Prime. Thekmor stood on his command bridge, watching the distance to the human defense line shrink on his tactical display. His 4 arms were spread wide, claws extended, ready for the glorious battle to come. Around him, his crew worked with the efficient brutality that had made the Velkari the most feared species in the galaxy. "All weapons charged and ready," reported his tactical officer. "Shields at maximum power," added the defense coordinator. "Fleet formation holding steady," confirmed the navigation officer. Thekmor's reptilian features twisted into what might have been a smile. "Today we teach these soft humans what it means to face the wrath of the Velkari. Today we show the galaxy that there is no defense against our might." The first weapons fired when the fleet was still 2 light minutes from the nearest human platform. Plasma cannons that could melt asteroids sent streams of superheated gas across space. Antimatter torpedoes capable of destroying space stations streaked toward their targets like falling stars. Quantum disruptors that had torn apart the crystalline cities of Mortax charged their deadly beams. It was the most powerful attack in Velkari history. The combined firepower of the fleet could have sterilized every planet in a solar system. Any other species would have been vaporized in the first few seconds. The human defense platforms absorbed the attack without even flickering. On Platform 7, Taimin Quan sat at his weapons console and watched the Velkari attack strike his station's shields. The energy readings were impressive. Any single one of those plasma bolts could have destroyed a city. But the platform's defenses had been built to withstand much worse than anything the Velkari could produce. "Shields holding at 98%, he reported to his commanding officer. "No damage to any systems." Around him, the other crew, members worked with the calm efficiency that came from years of training. They had drilled for this moment countless times, practicing until their responses became automatic. When the real battle finally came, they were ready. "All platforms report minimal shield damage," announced the communications officer. "Enemy weapons are having no significant effect." Taimin nodded and turned his attention to his targeting computer. The screen showed dozens of Velkari ships, each one painted with a red targeting square. The computer had already calculated the most efficient way to destroy the entire enemy fleet. All he had to do was pull the trigger. "Weapons free," ordered his commanding officer. "Eliminate all targets." Taimin's finger found the firing button. For a moment, he thought about the Velkari crews on those ships. They were living beings, with families and hopes and dreams. Then he remembered the intelligence reports about the 17 civilizations the Velkari had destroyed, the billions of innocent people who had been killed or enslaved. He pressed the button. Space erupted in silent death. The human weapons platforms fired as one, their beams reaching across impossible distances to touch their targets. But these weren't normal energy weapons that burned or melted their targets. These were quantum dissolution beams that simply made matter stop existing. The effect was instantaneous. Velkari ships that had survived battles with entire fleets simply came apart at the molecular level. Their hulls separated into component atoms, their crews dissolved into their basic elements, their weapons and shields and engines became clouds of free-floating particles. In less than 5 seconds, 30 Velkari warships ceased to exist. "Target Group Alpha eliminated," Taimin reported. "Moving to Target Group Beta." The platforms fired again, and 30 more ships vanished from existence. Then 30 more. The human weapons worked with mathematical precision, eliminating targets, in perfect order of priority. On his command ship, Thekmore watched his fleet disappear before his eyes. Ships that had served him for decades were simply erased from reality as if they had never existed. His sensors couldn't even detect debris. There was nothing left to detect. "Evasive maneuvers!" he roared. "All ships, scatter formation!" But it was too late. The human weapons platforms had surrounded the entire Velkari fleet in a sphere of destruction. No matter which direction the ships tried to run, they found more platforms waiting for them. The humans had planned this battle down to the smallest detail. Fighter pilot Mi Young-bae launched from her carrier just as the main battle began. Her interceptor was small and fast, designed to slip between the larger ships and strike at critical targets. Behind her flew 11 other pilots, all of them experts in close combat fighting. "Dragon Squadron, this is Dragon Leader," she said into her communication system. "We have multiple enemy fighters launching from the remaining Velkari ships. Our job is to keep them away from the platforms." The Velkari fighters were ugly, brutal-looking machines that moved like angry insects through space. They were fast and heavily armed, piloted by warriors who had been bred for violence. In any normal battle, they would have been terrifying opponents. But Mi Young had been training for this fight since she was 12 years old. She knew every weakness in Velkari fighter design, every flaw in their combat tactics. More importantly, she knew that human pilots had one advantage that no other species could match: the ability to think clearly under extreme pressure. "Dragon 2, take your wingman and hit the fighters coming from the left flank," she ordered. "Dragon 4, you're with me. We're going after their squadron leader." The space battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human fighters danced between enemy ships with impossible grace, their movements so precise they seemed choreographed. Velkari pilots who had never known defeat found themselves outmaneuvered by opponents who fought like machines but thought like artists. Mi Young locked her targeting system onto a Velkari squadron leader and fired. Her weapon was a miniature version of the quantum dissolution beam used by the platforms. The enemy fighter simply stopped existing, leaving its wingmen confused and leaderless. "This is Dragon Leader," she reported. "Enemy squadron leader eliminated. Remaining fighters are breaking formation." That was the thing about predator species. They were used to following strong leaders. When those leaders were removed, the rest of the pack often fell apart. The Velkari fighters began flying in random patterns, easy targets for the disciplined human pilots. Back on the Velkari command ship, Thekmore watched his fleet die around him. Of the 150 ships he had brought to this battle, fewer than 20 remained. His fighters had been swept from space like insects. His most powerful weapons had failed to even scratch the enemy's defenses. For the first time in his long life, the war prime of the Velkari felt true fear. "All remaining ships," he commanded, his voice no longer steady. "Retreat to minimum safe distance. We must regroup and—" "War prime," interrupted his sensor operator. "The human platforms are moving to surround us. They're cutting off our escape." Rotes. Thekmore looked at his tactical display and saw that it was true. The human weapons platforms were repositioning themselves with mechanical precision, forming a perfect cage around the remaining Velkari ships. Every direction he looked, he saw more human weapons pointing at his fleet. "Open a communication channel," he ordered. "I wish to speak with the human commander." "Channel open, War Prime." Thekmore straightened his massive frame and tried to project the authority that had served him throughout his career. "Human commander. This is War Prime Thekmore of the Velkari fleet. I demand that you allow my ships to withdraw. We acknowledge your superior defensive capabilities." The response came immediately, spoken in perfect Velkari by a calm female voice. "War Prime Thekmore, this is Admiral So Young Park of the Terran Defense Force. You were warned to turn back. You chose to attack instead. There will be no withdrawal." "You cannot simply destroy us!" Thekmore snarled. "We are a diplomatic mission. We came here to establish trade relations." "Your own communications logs, which we intercepted, prove that to be false," Admiral Park replied. "You came here to conquer and enslave. You spoke of feeding on human flesh and using our children as slaves. That was your mistake." Thekmore's blood ran cold. The humans had been listening to their private communications. They knew exactly what the Velkari had planned to do. "Please," he said, and the word felt strange in his mouth. The Velkari had no concept of mercy, so they rarely asked for it. "My crew. They were following orders. Allow them to live, and I will submit to whatever punishment you demand." "Your crew chose to follow those orders," Admiral Park replied. "They chose to participate in genocide, just as you chose to ignore our warnings. Choices have consequences, War Prime. Today you learn what those consequences are." The communication channel closed. Around the remaining Velkari ships, the human weapons platforms began to charge their weapons for the final attack. Thekmore looked around his bridge at the crew members who had served him faithfully for so many years. They were all staring at him, waiting for orders that could not save them. "Open a general communication channel," he said quietly. "All frequencies." When the channel was ready, he began to speak. His words would be the last tran. The news traveled faster than the fastest ships in the galaxy. Within days, every major civilization had heard the same impossible story. The Velkari fleet was gone. Not defeated, not damaged, not forced to retreat. Gone. Completely destroyed. Without inflicting a single casualty on their human opponents. In the crystal spires of the Altarian capital, scholars worked frantically to verify the reports. The Altarians were a peaceful species who survived through careful diplomacy and detailed knowledge of galactic politics. They had spent centuries mapping the rise and fall of every major power, and they knew that the destruction of the Velkari fleet changed everything. "The quantum resonance patterns are unmistakable," reported Chief Analyst Vel Taran to the High Council. "The energy signatures match no known weapon technology. Whatever the humans used, it operates on principles we don't understand." High Counselor. Zephyros, oldest and wisest of the Altarian leaders, studied the data with growing concern. 200 ships, he said slowly. The largest Velkari battle fleet ever assembled. Destroyed in 14 minutes with no human losses. How is this possible? "We don't know," admitted Vel Taran. "Our best scientists are studying the sensor readings, but the human weapons seem to work by simply making matter stop existing. We have no frame of reference for such technology." The implications were staggering. For centuries, galactic civilization had operated under certain basic assumptions. Big fleets defeated small fleets. Advanced technology overcame primitive weapons. Numerical superiority eventually won wars. The humans had just proven all of those assumptions wrong. Meanwhile, in the war chambers of the Kralix Dominion, a very different conversation was taking place. The Kralix were conquerors like the Velkari, but smarter and more cautious. They had built their empire through careful planning and overwhelming force, always making sure they outnumbered their enemies by at least 10 to 1. Overlord Vorth, supreme commander of the Kralix military, stared at the tactical display that showed the last known positions of the Velkari fleet. Red dots marked where each ship had been destroyed, creating a perfect pattern that spoke of surgical precision and absolute control. "What are your recommendations, War Master?" he asked his chief military advisor. War Master Jektal was a scarred veteran who had planned the conquest of 6 different star systems. He was not easily impressed or frightened, but right now his hands were shaking as he pointed to the display. "Overlord, we must immediately cancel all operations in sectors adjacent to human space," he said. "The humans have demonstrated defensive capabilities that exceed our understanding. Any attempt to challenge them would be suicide." Vorth's eyes narrowed. The Kralix had been planning to expand into several systems near human territory. Those worlds contained valuable resources and weak defenses, exactly the kind of easy targets the Kralliks preferred. You're suggesting we change our expansion plans because of one battle? Vorth demanded. I'm suggesting we change our expansion plans because of what that one battle revealed, Jektal replied. Overlord, the humans didn't just defeat the Velkari fleet. They erased it. There's a difference between winning a battle and demonstrating that your opponent never had a chance to begin with. The Kralliks' overlord was silent for a long moment. He had built his career on reading the balance of power in the galaxy, on knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. What he was seeing in these reports was something entirely new, a species that didn't seem to want to conquer anyone, but was clearly capable of destroying anyone who tried to conquer them. Issue new orders. To all fleet commanders, he said finally, human space is now classified as a no-approach zone. Any ship that comes within 10 light years of the human boundary without explicit authorization will be court-martialed. Yes, Overlord. And War Master, find out everything you can about human technology. If they can do this to the Velkari, we need to know what else they're capable of. The ripples of the Velkari defeat spread outward through every level of galactic society. On Hegemony Prime, the seat of the loose confederation that governed most civilized worlds, an emergency session of the Galactic Council was called. The council chamber was a vast dome that could hold representatives from over 1,000 different species. Today, it was packed beyond capacity as delegates struggled to understand what the Velkari defeat meant for the balance of power in the galaxy. Ambassador Do Hyun Shin sat in the human delegation area, a small section near the back of the chamber. Until today, humans had been considered a minor species, advanced enough to be granted council membership, but too small and distant to matter in galactic politics. Now every eye in the chamber was focused on him. The Kralliks' representative, a massive creature called Vorth, was speaking from the central podium. Honored delegates, we must address the obvious question. What are the humans planning to do with their new military capabilities? Are they planning to expand their territory, to demand tribute from neighboring systems, to establish dominance over trade routes? Du Hyun stood up slowly, and the chamber fell silent. He was a small man compared to most of the alien delegates, dressed in a simple gray suit that looked almost plain next to the elaborate robes and armor worn by other species. But when he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the vast space. Honored delegates, he began, the human delegation would like to make our position clear. We have no intention of expanding our territory. We have no plans to demand tribute from anyone. We do not wish to establish dominance over any trade routes or systems. A murmur ran through the chamber. This was not what most delegates had expected to hear. Then what do you want? Called out the Zephyrian representative, her crystalline voice ringing like wind chimes. Du Hyun's answer was simple and direct. We want to be left alone. The chamber erupted in confusion. Species throughout the galaxy had fought wars over territory, resources, trade rights, and political influence. The idea of a powerful civilization that simply wanted to be ignored was almost incomprehensible. You're saying that you have the power to conquer any of us, but you don't want to? Asked the Centaurian delegate. We're saying that we have the power to defend ourselves, and we hope that will be enough, Do Hyun replied. The Velkari chose to attack us. We defended ourselves. If other species choose to respect our borders and leave us in peace, there will be no conflict. And if someone else decides to test your defenses? Pressed the Kralliks' representative. Du Hyun's expression didn't change, but something in his tone made the entire chamber feel colder. Then they will discover that our response to the Velkari was proportionate to the threat they represented. If someone brings a larger threat, they should expect a proportionally larger response. The implications of that statement hung in the air like a physical presence. The humans had just destroyed the most powerful fleet in Velkari history, and they were saying that had been a proportionate response. Every delegate in the chamber was suddenly wondering what a disproportionate response would look like. After the council session ended, delegates from dozens of species approached Do Hyun privately. Some offered trade agreements, others proposed mutual defense pacts, and a few simply wanted to establish formal diplomatic relations. All of them had the same underlying message: we respect your power and we don't want to be your enemy. Do Hyun accepted the diplomatic overtures politely, but made it clear that any formal agreements would require extensive negotiations. The humans were willing to talk, but they weren't going to be rushed into anything. Later that evening, in his private quarters on Hegemony Prime, Do Hyun composed a report for his superiors back on Earth. The message was brief and to the point. Mission successful. Galactic community has received the message clearly. Human space will be respected. No species is currently planning aggressive action against our territory. Recommend maintaining current defensive posture while exploring selected diplomatic opportunities. He paused before adding a final line. Note, several species have expressed curiosity about human technology and defensive capabilities. Recommend increased security around all research installations. Because while the galaxy might have learned to respect human power, respect and fear were not the same as trust. And fear, Do Hyun knew from his study of history, had a way of making people do very stupid things. In the depths of space, automated monitoring stations began detecting subtle changes in galactic shipping patterns. Trade routes that had run near human space for centuries were suddenly rerouted to give the human boundary a wide margin. Commercial traffic that had once flowed freely through dozens of systems now moved in careful arcs that avoided any possibility of accidentally entering human territory. The galaxy was learning to live with a new reality. There was a region of space where even the strongest predators feared to go, and at the center of that region, humanity continued its quiet existence, watching the stars and hoping that the lesson they had taught would be enough to keep the peace. But they were also preparing for the possibility that it wouldn't be. 3 months after the Velkari fleet became scattered atoms in the void, the galaxy had settled into an uneasy calm. Trade routes flowed around human space like water around a stone. Diplomatic messages were carefully worded to avoid any hint of threat or aggression. Most species had learned the lesson the humans intended to teach, but the Zephyrians had always been different. Research Prime Zythalon floated in his command chamber aboard the science vessel Quantum Seeker, his crystalline body pulsing with soft blue light as he studied the sensor readings. The Zephyrians were not warriors like the Velkari or the Kralix. They were scientists and explorers, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the universe around them. That curiosity had made them one of the most advanced species in the galaxy. It had also made them dangerously arrogant. The human boundary is still showing the same energy patterns, reported his chief science officer, a younger Zephyrian whose crystal structure gleamed with purple highlights. No changes in the defensive grid since the Velkari incident. Zythalon's internal light flickered in what his species considered deep thought. The Zephyrians had been studying the human defenses from a safe distance for months, trying to understand how the weapons worked. The scientific implications were staggering. If they could reverse engineer the human technology, it would advance Zephyrian science by centuries. "Have we detected any patrol ships?" he asked. "Only one. Research Prime. A single vessel maintaining position approximately 1 light-year inside the boundary. Its energy signature suggests it's much smaller than the weapons platforms." Zythalon made what passed for a smile among his species, a brightening of his internal crystalline structure. "One small patrol ship to guard an entire sector of space. Either the humans are incredibly confident, or they're not as well defended as they want us to believe." The truth was that Zythalon couldn't accept the idea that any species could be so technologically superior to the Zephyrians. His people had been the galaxy's leading scientists for thousands of years. They had invented faster-than-light travel, quantum computers, and artificial gravity. The idea that some primitive mammals could have weapons beyond Zephyrian understanding was simply impossible. "Set course for the human boundary," he ordered. "We're going to conduct a close-range survey of their defensive systems." "Research Prime," said his navigation officer hesitantly. "Our orders were to maintain a safe distance. The Council specifically forbade any approach to human space." Zithalon's light pulsed with irritation. "The Council is being overly cautious. We're not a military vessel. We're scientists conducting peaceful research. Surely even the humans won't object to the pursuit of knowledge." The Quantum Seeker was not a warship. It carried no weapons beyond basic defensive systems, and its crew of 30 was made up entirely of researchers and technicians. But it was also one of the most advanced vessels ever built, equipped with sensors that could analyze matter at the subatomic level and computers that could process data faster than most planetary networks. If any ship could safely study the human defenses, Zithalon believed it was his. The journey to the human boundary took 6 days. As they traveled, the science teams worked around the clock to calibrate their instruments for the upcoming survey. They had theories about how the human weapons might work: exotic matter manipulation, quantum field disruption, dimensional phase shifting, and they were eager to test those theories. On the 6th day, they reached the edge of human space. "Boundary marker confirmed," reported the navigation officer. "We are now at the established perimeter of human territory." Zithalon studied the readings on his personal display. Space ahead looked perfectly normal. No visible weapons platforms, no energy barriers, no obvious signs of the defensive grid that had destroyed the Velkari fleet. But his sensors were detecting subtle quantum fluctuations that suggested something was definitely out there. "Begin passive scans," he ordered. "I want detailed readings on every energy signature within 50 light minutes of our position." The Quantum Seeker's sensors reached out into space, probing the apparently empty void for signs of the human defenses. For several hours, they detected nothing unusual. Space seemed to be exactly what it appeared to be: empty. Then, gradually, they began to pick up traces of something extraordinary. "Research Prime," called his chief science officer, excitement making her crystalline voice ring like wind chimes. "I'm detecting quantum signatures that shouldn't be possible. There are objects in space that exist in a state of dimensional flux, partially in our reality, partially somewhere else." Zithalon's internal light blazed with scientific excitement. "Dimensional phase technology, I knew it! The humans have found a way to shift matter between dimensional planes. That's how their weapons can appear and disappear so quickly." What he didn't realize was that his passive scans had already been detected. Captain Dongwook Han sat in the command chair of the patrol vessel Vigilant, watching the Zephyrian science ship through his long-range sensors. His ship was positioned well inside human space, invisible to alien detection systems, but perfectly capable of monitoring everything that happened at the boundary. "Captain," reported his sensor officer, "the alien vessel is conducting active scans of the defensive grid. They're trying to analyze our technology." Dongwook nodded calmly. He had been expecting something like this. The Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy for their scientific curiosity, and the human defenses represented the greatest scientific mystery they had ever encountered. It was inevitable that they would try to study it. "Any signs they're preparing to cross the boundary?" he asked. "Not yet, sir. They're maintaining position just outside the perimeter, but their scans are getting more detailed and invasive." Dongwook considered his options. The Zephyrians weren't being openly aggressive, but they were clearly trying to steal human technology. That was a form of espionage, and espionage was not tolerated in human space. "Open a communication channel," he ordered. On the Quantum Seeker, Zithalon was deep in discussion with his science team when the communication alert sounded. The message came through clear and strong, transmitted on standard diplomatic frequencies. "Zephyrian vessel, this is Captain Dongwook Han of the Terran. Patrol ship Vigilant. You are conducting unauthorized scans of human defensive systems. Cease your activities immediately and withdraw to a safe distance. Zithalon's internal light flickered with annoyance. Open a reply channel, he ordered. When the connection was established, he spoke in his most diplomatic tone. Captain Han, this is Research Prime Zithalon of the Zephyrian science vessel Quantum Seeker. We are conducting peaceful scientific research in neutral space. Surely you don't object to the pursuit of knowledge. The human's response was immediate and firm. Research Prime, you are attempting to analyze classified military technology without authorization. This constitutes espionage. You have 30 seconds to cease your scans and withdraw, or you will be considered a hostile vessel. Zithalon's crystalline structure pulsed with indignation. Captain, we are scientists, not spies. We seek only to understand the universe around us. Knowledge should belong to all species, not be hoarded by one. 20 seconds, came the cold reply. Around the bridge of the Quantum Seeker, the science team looked at each other nervously. They had all heard what happened to the Velkari fleet, but they were scientists, not warriors. Surely the humans wouldn't destroy a peaceful research vessel. Research Prime, whispered his navigation officer. Perhaps we should comply with their request. Zithalon's pride wouldn't let him back down. The Zephyrians were the galaxy's premier scientists. They shouldn't have to ask permission to study interesting phenomena, especially when that study could benefit all of galactic civilization. Continue the scans, he ordered. We have as much right to be here as they do. 10 seconds, came the human voice. Research Prime, please, urged his chief science officer. Our mission isn't worth dying for. But Zithalon was convinced that the humans were bluffing. No civilized species would destroy a science vessel for conducting passive scans. It would be an act of barbarism that would turn the entire galaxy against them. 5 seconds. The countdown reached 0. For a moment, nothing happened. The Quantum Seeker continued its scans, its crew holding their breath as they waited to see what the humans would do. Then, space around the ship began to change. Research Prime, screamed the sensor operator. I'm detecting massive quantum distortions all around us. Something is destabilizing our hull at the molecular level. Zithalon stared at his displays in horror as the readings showed his ship literally coming apart. The human weapons weren't destroying the Quantum Seeker with explosions or energy beams. They were simply making the bonds that held its atoms together stop working. Emergency protocols, he shouted. All power to structural integrity fields. But it was too late. The process had already begun, and nothing in Zephyrian technology could stop it. The hull of the science vessel began to peel away in layers, like the petals of a flower opening in fast motion. Zithalon's last act was to activate the ship's emergency beacon, broadcasting a final message on all Zephyrian frequencies. The humans! They don't distinguish between military vessels and science ships. Stay away! Stay away from their space! The transmission cut off as Admiral Sung Ho Jong stood at the great window of his office on Earth, watching the Pacific Ocean stretch toward the horizon. 6 months had passed since the first Velkari ship had crossed into human space, and the galaxy had learned to live with a new reality. The numbers on his desk told the story clearly. 347 attempted incursions, 347 total eliminations, 0 human casualties. The Terran defense grid had worked exactly as designed. His assistant, Commander Young Mi Park, entered, the office carrying a stack of reports. Sir, the monthly summary from all boundary stations. Also, we have 3 new diplomatic requests from species wanting to establish formal trade relations. Sung Ho accepted the reports and scanned through them quickly. The pattern was always the same. Some ship would approach the boundary, either out of curiosity or aggression or simple mistake. The grid would detect them, issue a warning, and then eliminate them if they didn't comply. It was efficient, effective, and absolutely ruthless. Any of the incursions show signs of organized military action? He asked. No, sir. Most were individual, ships or small groups. Pirates mostly, trying to raid mining stations. A few survey vessels from various species testing our response times. Nothing like the original Velkari fleet. Xiang-Ho nodded. That was good news in a way. It meant that the galaxy's major powers had gotten the message and were staying away from human space. But it also meant that the smaller, stupider criminal elements hadn't learned yet. They probably never would. What about the diplomatic requests? The Altarians want to expand their trade agreement to include rare earth elements. The Centaurian Republic is offering to share star charts of the Outer Rim in exchange for medical technology. And the Wanderer clans are proposing a mutual protection pact. Xiang-Ho raised an eyebrow at the last item. The Wanderer clans were nomadic traders who traveled throughout the galaxy, never staying in one place for long. They were also some of the most informed beings in known space, with contacts and information networks that reached into every corner of civilization. A mutual protection pact? What do the Wanderers need protection from? Young Mai consulted her. Notes. According to their message, several pirate organizations have been targeting their trade caravans. They believe that a formal alliance with humanity would discourage attacks. It was a clever move, Xiang-Ho had to admit. The Wanderers knew that no one in the galaxy wanted to risk angering humanity right now. By allying themselves with humans, they would gain protection without having to build their own military forces. Set up a meeting with Ambassador Jaewon Cho, he decided. These diplomatic proposals need careful consideration. As young Mai left to arrange the meeting, Xiang-Ho turned back to the window. The view was peaceful and serene, showing no signs of the vast military apparatus that protected this world and all the others in human space. That was intentional. Humanity had always preferred to keep its defenses hidden until they were needed. The communication system on his desk chimed softly. "Admiral," came the voice of his aide, "you have an incoming call from Professor Hei-Ri Song at the Academy. She says it's about her research project." "Put her through," Xiang-Ho said. Professor Song's face appeared on the screen, her expression excited despite the late hour. She was a military historian who had been studying the effects of the grid on galactic politics, and her work was becoming required reading at universities throughout human space. "Admiral, I wanted to update you on my research findings," she said without preamble. "The changes in galactic shipping patterns are even more dramatic than we initially thought." "How so?" Xiang-Ho asked. "Trade routes that used to pass within. 50 light-years of our boundary have been moved to avoid coming within 200 light-years of human space. Some commercial vessels are adding weeks to their journey times just to ensure they don't accidentally stray into our territory." The professor brought up a holographic star map that showed the old trade routes in blue and the new ones in red. The difference was striking. Where the old routes had flowed naturally through space, taking the most efficient paths between star systems, the new routes curved and twisted in elaborate patterns designed to give human space the widest possible margin. "It's fear," Professor Song continued. "Not respect, not caution, pure fear. The entire galaxy is terrified of accidentally provoking us." Xiang-Ho studied the map thoughtfully. "Is that necessarily a bad thing? In the short term? No. It's given us perfect security and prevented any major conflicts. But in the long term," the professor paused, choosing her words carefully, "fear can make people do unpredictable things. It can also unite enemies who might otherwise fight each other." It was a valid concern. Throughout history, common fears had brought together strange alliances. If the galaxy's major powers decided that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to exist, they might overcome their mutual hatred long enough to work together against the common threat. "What are your recommendations?" Xiang-Ho asked. "Selective engagement," Professor Song replied immediately. "We need to show the galaxy that we can be reasonable partners, not just an unstoppable force. The diplomatic initiatives are a good start, but we need to be more active in demonstrating that we're not a threat to species that leave us alone. After the call ended, Seung-ho spent several hours reading through the professor's full report. Her analysis was thorough and troubling. The grid had given humanity perfect security, but it had also created a situation where every other species in the galaxy saw them as an existential threat. The next morning, he met with Ambassador Jae-won Cho in the secure conference room deep beneath the Defense Command building. Cho was an experienced diplomat who had been instrumental in establishing humanity's few successful relationships with alien species. "The professor is right," Cho said after reviewing the situation reports. "We are too isolated. The grid is working perfectly from a security standpoint, but it's making us look like paranoid hermits to the rest of the galaxy." "What do you suggest?" Seung-ho asked. "We need to be more visible in galactic affairs, but carefully. Limited trade relationships with trustworthy species, cultural exchanges, maybe even joint scientific projects with groups like the Altarians. Show the galaxy that we're people, not just an automated defense system." They discussed the details for several hours, working out a careful plan for increased engagement that wouldn't compromise human security. The key was to meet with alien representatives in neutral space, never allowing anyone inside the grid's perimeter. 3 weeks later, Ambassador Cho found himself aboard a space station in the Centauri system, sitting across a conference table from representatives of 6 different species. It was the first major diplomatic gathering involving humans since the Velkari incident, and every word would be analyzed by intelligence services throughout the galaxy. The Altarian ambassador, a tall being with silver skin and large black eyes, spoke first. "Ambassador Cho, we appreciate humanity's willingness to engage in these discussions. Many of our governments were uncertain about your intentions after recent events." Cho smiled politely. "We understand the concerns. Humanity's defensive capabilities have been demonstrated quite dramatically, but we want to make it clear that we have no aggressive intentions toward any peaceful species." "Define peaceful," interjected the Kralix representative, a massive creature whose scarred hide spoke of many battles. "Any species that respects our territorial boundaries and doesn't attempt to harm human citizens or interests," Cho replied simply. "And if someone violates those boundaries accidentally?" asked the Zephyrian delegate, her crystalline voice carrying a note of barely controlled fear. Cho's expression became more serious. "Our boundary warnings are broadcast on all frequencies in over 100 languages. The chances of an accidental violation are minimal. But to answer your question directly, intent doesn't matter to our defense systems. Results are what matter." The blunt honesty seemed to unsettle several of the delegates, but Cho believed it was necessary. False reassurances would only lead to tragic misunderstandings later. The Wanderer clan representative, an ancient being whose species was older than most civilizations, spoke up. "Ambassador, many of our people remember when the galaxy was different, when trade flowed freely and borders were suggestions rather than death sentences. Do you believe we can return to such times?" Cho considered the question carefully. "We believe in a galaxy where species can coexist peacefully, each respecting the other's sovereignty. If that means some borders are more strictly enforced than they used to be, perhaps that's a fair price for avoiding the kind of genocidal wars that species like the Velkari brought to so many worlds." The meeting continued for several days, establishing the framework for limited trade agreements and cultural exchanges. When it ended, Cho felt cautiously optimistic. The other species were beginning to see humanity as something more than just a mysterious threat, but he also knew that the real test would come later when the agreements were put into practice and the galaxy learned whether humans could truly be trusted as partners rather than just feared as enemies. Back on Earth, Admiral Seung-ho received regular reports on the diplomatic progress. The numbers were encouraging: several successful trade deals, a joint scientific project with the Altarians, and a mutual defense agreement.